So for now, we'd like to welcome up the third panel, which is going to be on resistance. So if you're a panellist for the resistance panel, please could you make your way to the front? So I'd just like to introduce Jonathan Saha. So as already mentioned, as the co-author of the RHS's report on race and ethnicity, Dr. Jonathan Saha has been long concerned with ideas of equality and inclusion within the historical discipline. I luckily met him last year in York at our workshop on this very report. Jonathan really does practice what he preaches, as since then he has helped us look into funding opportunities for this conference, as well as personally helped me with MA applications. His work on British Burma and the colonial policing of insanity is especially important, and it is my privilege to introduce him as the chair of our panel on resistance today.
Thank you very much. So I think we can all agree this has been an incredible conference so far, and it's just testament to the organisers, of Claire and Olivia, but also to the spirit that I think everybody is engaging with it. And so I'm going to keep running this as Esme ran the previous session, which is to move quickly into the presentations. I'll do a quick sum up after that, and then we'll open it up for wider questions. And I'm guessing that Catherine will return at that point as well. So I'm going to hand over to Sanmitra Sarkar from the University of Warwick, who's going to be talking about Black Panthers and medical care.
Good afternoon, audience. It has been a worse day, very rainy, but I hope it improves. Firstly, I would like to thank University of York and the organizers of this conference for giving us students the wonderful opportunity to present marginalized histories in their true colors. As a first-year student, it is both an honor and a privilege to be a part of this conference. I'm sorry. Moving on, my topic of research is the Black Panther Party and its contribution to healthcare. Now, when you Google Black Panther Party, you must have seen the first things that pop up on your screen are guns, barrels, armed patrols, and Edgar Hoover, but not stethoscopes. State-sponsored discrimination and violence did invite a number of violent reprisals. However, healthcare initiatives, among a range of others, were one of the most significant and least propagated contributions of the Black Panther Party. Impelled by poverty, unemployment, discrimination against the African American community, and triggered by numerous incidents of police brutality, political activists, African American activists, Bobby Seale and Huey Newton formed the Black Panther Party in 1966 in Oakland, California. The 10-point program, however, clarifies the fact that policing the police, which was one of their initial first aims, was only one of their aims, and neither the only one nor was it the most important one. The 10-point program demanded employment, education, housing, health, the bare necessities of a decent life for the African American community. The Panthers, however, did not merely speak or demand those. They stood up for those, and they provided those facilities themselves. They took up the onerous responsibility of organizing a breakfast program for children, providing free healthcare, free ambulance service, drug and alcohol rehabilitation, free schooling, so on and so forth. The list is quite long. And this was particularly needed for the oppressed communities of the Black Panther. I beg your pardon. It was especially needed for the oppressed communities of the African Americans because their healthcare facilities were severely limited. One of the reasons was because of a long history of racism, and secondly, on an average, they were much poorer than the rest of the population. Now, I would like to present a case of a Black Panther Party, which the Black Panther Party, in its February 1970 newspaper, it actually documented an incident of medical negligence of a four-month-old African American infant, James Anthony Nero of Brownsville, a neighborhood in Brooklyn, New York. Suffering from chest congestion and fever, he was rushed to the local hospital only to be allegedly sent home without proper medication or treatment. A few days later, Anthony Nero, was found dead. Was declared dead by the hospital after he was rushed to the hospital when he was unconscious. Brownsville, like many other African American neighborhoods, was deprived of proper municipal services and garbage was piled up. This settlement was naturally prey to pneumonia and other diseases like flu viruses. They were infested with mosquito, rats, and cockroaches. This is the graph that clearly shows the glaring difference between African American and white population, the incomes of these populations. The difference is quite significant. The Black Panther movement was not unique to black politics. It is what is called the social movement spillover in sociological literature. Actually, the Black Panther movement was an heir to a long medical civil rights movement. The basic ideological moorings and groundings of the party were inevitably leftist, and it aimed to embrace healthcare activism as a means to ensuring the survival of community with dignity. 4 political thinkers, activists, and leaders had great influence on the policy framing of the party. Martin Luther King, Frantz Fanon, the Pan-Africanist, humanist, and leftist, who identified medicine as a sure and potential instrument of colonialism. Che Guevara, who himself was a physician, and placed medicine at the center of the revolutionary struggle. The first, foremost, and most important contribution of the Black Panther Party to healthcare was probably the PFMCs, the People's Free Medical Clinics. These clinics were free of cost or very low cost. They provided health services like medical testing of diseases like lead poisoning and, most importantly, sickle cell anemia, which was rampant in the African American population at that point in time, and it was least funded by the government. So the Black Panther Party took up the responsibility to provide free and very free and very easy sickle cell anemia testing for the African American population. And not only were the African American population welcome to be treated as in the PFMCs, the other oppressed people were also equally welcome, and they were also given equally fair and free treatment. It was a very significant move, and in 1970, by 1970, most of Black Panther Party chapters had a free clinic and a breakfast program. The Franklin Lynch people, its free health clinic was the first to ensure that most of the African American population were treated and got a sickle cell anemia testing done, either in their homes or in their clinics. Now, these clinics were not large hospitals. They were basically set up in trailers and storefronts. These are newspaper excerpts of the Black Panther Party daily, and these actually provide a detailed analysis of the disease of lead poisoning, which is in this case, and many of them also do for sickle cell anemia too, and they are very informative even for people who are not of the medical field and don't understand technical language. It is the newspaper, as I feel, is not simply a means of propaganda. It was a means of spreading information on diseases, on their programs and various services. Now, fundraising was a major issue. Evidence that Panthers had consolidated mass support of both black people and white people was that churches, private firms, pharmaceutical companies readily supported their healthcare initiatives. As Dr. Tolbert Small, who formerly headed the Sickle Cell Anemia Foundation of the Black Panther Party, recalled in an interview how he used to persuade pharmaceutical companies to donate medicines, medical equipment, and persuade doctors and nurses to provide free services in their spare time. And the fact that they did so proved that the Black Panther Party was not an African American supremacist party, and it had considerable support of the white population as well. The book Black Panther Party Service to the People programs mentioned that in the city of Winston-Salem, North Carolina, a grant was received from the Episcopal Church's General Convention Special Program for the purchase and maintaining of the People's Ambulance Service vehicles. Now, these vehicles were free of cost to any person from the African American community or from oppressed communities could call the ambulance free of cost, and they were going to be taken to the hospitals or to medical clinics. Now, as we know, this state was hostile. The response of the state was hostile as well. The public and the police, the public health agencies and the police went all out to show the PFMCs and the Black Panther Party in a very bad light. as is evidence from documents now in public domain, it was one of the conscious policies of the FBI, Federal Bureau of Investigation, under Edgar Hoover, to prevent the BPP from gaining any respectability from any section of the society. He vituperaously attacked the BPP, labeling it as an existential threat to the USA. His exact words were, I quote, "The BPP is the greatest threat to the internal security of the country." And then the health clinics were also not an exception. They were bombed, they were fired, and they were shut down on flimsy grounds. So without the state support, and in many cases fighting state hostilities, the Black Panther Party did its work till 1982, when it was finally disbanded. Now, when we are talking about legacy, we need to remember that not many people will remember the Black Panther Party for its healthcare initiatives or for its breakfast program, not even for its free ambulance. But the fact that there was a legacy is proven by the fact that in 1991, 10,000 copies of the Black Panther Party newspapers were sold in the USA in 1991. So, as the speakers mentioned, that history of colored peoples is quite often and quite substantially whitewashed. So, when we are talking about legacy, I think Black Panther Party and parties like these, which have contributed to society, not to a particular community, but to the oppressed and marginalized people, they should be remembered in their true colors. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sunita. Next speaker is Laura Neboot from the University of St Andrews, who's going to be talking about space for marginalized women in colonial Peru.
First of all, thank you for having me and for organizing this conference, Olivier and Claire. So, a little background on my research. I was doing a project with the aim of focusing on two women who were both trialed and condemned for their involvement in an indigenous revolt in Peru in the 18th century. Both of them, as punishment for their actions, were sent to the place that is my topic today, which is the Beaterio de las Emparadas de la Purísima Concepción. So, sorry, I think there's a problem with the... It's not supposed to look like this. Is it just a layout? Okay. Sorry about the layout. I hope everyone can still read. So first a definition, so you can all understand what I'm talking about. A beaterio is a community or house of women living under informal religious vows. That means that they still had a mother superior, but they were not expected to take vows. Amparadas in Spanish means protected or sheltered women. And the Purísima Concepción is the Immaculate Conception, so the religious under they were under. The house also functioned as a recogimiento and was referred to using both names, but I will explain in more detail later exactly what this entails. Now, when I first started my research, I thought the easiest part of my job would be to find more information about this beaterio compared to the history of the two women I was researching. Peru, like most countries of Latin America, was in the 18th century and is still today a deeply religious country. and it is not unusual to see nuns in the streets of Lima or to come across a religious procession. To give you an idea, this is one of the biggest religious processions that happens in Peru every year. But I soon found out that the name of the emperadas didn't ring a bell to any Peruvian that I mentioned it to, which I went into this research thinking there would be tons of literature about this beaterio. What I found instead was a place that was barely mentioned in footnotes or in passing, and whose story had never been written down fully. So what I'll be talking about today is the story of this beaterio, its importance in Peruvian and women history, and its deeply tumultuous history from its beginnings in the 16th century to its closure in the 19th century. So what was this place and what made it so special? First, let's set the scene. Peru in the 16th century was ruled by the Spanish crown, and like in the rest of the colonies, the role of women officially belonged in the spheres either of family and marriage or into the religious order when they were not married. When women started to wander out of these very defined lines, it became a problem for a society that did not know what to do with them. This is where the idea of the recogimiento first came in. It was an institution that was born in Spain in the 16th century as an enclosed place for women, both to protect them from the outside world without the strict vows of a convent, but also used to protect the outside world from their immoral behavior. The word comes from the Spanish recoger, which means to take in, but also to collect and pick up, which shows both aspects of this kind of place. There is an excellent book about this topic by Nancy Van Dusen, Between the Sacred and the Worldly, and the title really shows a perfect summary of the nature of this place. It was a space between the sacred and the worldly for women. So just like in Spain, in 16th century Peru, there is starting to be a wish to control what was referred to as the lost women of Lima, the capital of Peru. It was a wish that came both from the clergy and the crown, and who saw these women as living on the fringes of social respectability. There were some plans at the beginning of the 17th century to start such a house, but it is not until 1670, thanks to the support of the Viceroy Conde de Lemos and the priest Francisco del Castillo, that the house actually opens. Just to show you, this is what Peru looked like at the time. It still looks fairly similar today. And I'm just mentioning the location because it would later be a source of problems for the emperadas. But in 1670, when it was first inaugurated, the founders had a much more important issues on their hands. The beaterio was empty and there was no candidates for entry for 2 months. There's a very simple reason why. The institution was meant to be, according to the posters around town, a voluntary and free retreat for repentant women and for girls in danger of losing their virtue. Obviously, no woman would voluntarily call herself a fallen woman, and on the day of opening, there were no candidates for admission. The disappointment of the founders must have turned to panic when weeks went by and still no candidates came forward. For 2 months, the beaterio was empty, while one of the founders, Francisco del Castillo, went through the city trying to recruit women. Finally, 2 months after the opening in May 1670, 9 women joined the beaterio. So how did the beaterio actually function? It was a common place for women going through divorces, but also for women who had lost their husband and or their family, and who had to live their household. They could live their household either because they wanted a respite from their husband or the mundane life, but more often they were sent there by their husband, who believed that they needed some time to behave properly again. So it sort of functioned as a gray area for women, where they did not have to leave the secular world, but they were not really entering the religious one either. Although they did not have to take vows, it was understood that their life was turned towards God and spiritual expression. In 1690 is the first change to the nature of the beaterio. The Viceroy Conde de Monclova adds to the duties of the beaterio to receive prostitutes and scandalous women, i.e., that is, women who had committed crimes or who had charges pressed against them, as there were no real prison for women until the end of the 19th century. They were supposed to live separate from the rest of women, but under the rule of the same Mother Superior, who was there to correct their habits.
And with so many additions, both voluntary and imposed with correctional purposes, by 1708 the Beaterio had over 200 women living in it, and struggled financially with so many inputs. Because of the nature of the Beaterio, it's also important to mention that compared to convents, who welcomed daughters of the higher classes family, that is, white families, most of the women who came to the Beaterio were either mestizas or indias, that is, mixed race or indigenous women. So they struggled financially because of so many women in the Beaterio, but this problem was almost inconsequential compared to what happened to them in the 18th century. So, as said before, the location of the Beaterio was important. It was built right next to the house where Santa Rosa de Lima had spent her last weeks and passed away in the 17th century. So who is Santa Rosa de Lima? She is still the most popular saint in Peru to this day. She's a patron saint of Lima, Peru, and of all of the Americas. She was the first canonized saint of the continent, and she was beloved by Peruvians and still is today for miraculously saving the city from plunder during a battle against the Dutch. In the beginning of the 18th century, we then have more and more women wanting to live under her patronage, and the Beaterio they had at the time was becoming too small for their project of becoming a convent. So the green dot is where the Beaterio of Santa Rosa was first. They also had the support from various prominent members of the city who wanted to promote the cult of the saint, as well as create a prestigious convent for their daughters, judging the ones of the empanadas to be unfit for them because of the lost women it received. They seem to have been dissatisfied with the location of the current Beaterio, which was away from the rest of the monasteries. You can see some letters around the red dot, which is the empanadas, and there were a lot of convents and monasteries there. And they were also too close to their liking to the Rimac River that you see right under, which they deemed prejudicial to their health. Apparently, the convents neighboring the empanadas also approved of this move, for they were unhappy with the repentant women the Beaterio sheltered. So what happens in 1708 is that the Beaterio de las Rosas evicts the empanadas from their place without any legal or real power to do so. Despite the public outcry and their attempts at getting their house back, the Beaterio de las Rosas keeps the house of the empanadas, and many of the empanadas themselves are forced to go back to their houses if they have some, or to find another place to live. This could have been the end of the Beaterio de las Empanadas, but they never stopped fighting for their space. 15 years later, they are given the space that was abandoned by the Beaterio de las Rosas itself, and 10 years later, they are moved again to a slightly bigger space. Still, the empanadas never managed to recover from their altercation with what soon became the Convent de Santa Rosa, and its reputation was tarnished forever. So this was the original Beaterio de las Empanadas, and to this day, the Santa Rosa convent still occupies this space and is one of the largest religious groups of the capital. A century after its founding, there seems to have been some hope again for the Empanadas, thanks to new funds given by the king, and they are given a new space, the San Pedro Hospital of Priests, which will be the last place where they will live. In addition to them, they are to share the space with a school for indigenous girls and an asylum for poor women. Once again, the Beaterio was given the task of an official jail for criminal women, which is when the two women of my original research came to stay there. However, by the 19th century, there seems to have been quite a disorder according to the church and governments concerning the Beaterios. So this is a new place that we're given. There's pictures of the new space. So the disorder that occurred was because the point of the Beaterio at first was to separate women completely from the world, but that didn't really happen. In complicity with the porch guard over the nuns, women managed to receive messages and even visitors from the outside, including lovers. In not a few cases, surprise husbands found their wives walking at night on Lima Street, sometimes alone, sometimes in entertaining company. And in 1804, the Archbishop of Lima at the time makes a surprise visit to the Beaterio. What he finds is a place for women to roam freely, entering and living the house as they wished, and with such happiness that it did not look at all like a house of recogimiento. Because of this visit, the Archbishop made drastic and strict changes to the house and its functioning, prohibiting the entry of men and limiting the number of women. He realized that most women were there because of the free space the Beaterio offered rather than religious purposes, and the conditions of the house changed to such an extent that of the 200 women who were there at the time, only 8 remained. This was the start of this decline, like with most of the beateries in Lima. People no longer saw them as a necessary institution, and it was reaching its full disappearance alongside the lifestyle it used to advocate. By the end of the 1860s, the beatery had closed down, and the place was bought back to put what is still today the School of Fine Arts of Peru. So why does this story matter? The reasons I got so interested in this story and thought it was important to share were various. Obviously, it was a part of the city of Lima, where I come from, that had been left aside, and thanks to which we can know more about its buildings and inhabitants, its religious but also secular history. While the story of the convent of Santa Rosa is presented as a success story for the higher classes daughter of the society, the story of the poor women of Lima and their shelter seemed to have been cast aside for too long. But I was also particularly touched by the stories of the women there who all resisted in their own ways, either those imprisoned there for their rebellious actions, or the ones who, entering voluntarily, managed to have some control on their lives in this space, which, although first built to contain them, they still managed to use to step out of the clear lines traced for them by society. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Laura. Our next speaker is Rowan Alexandra from the University of York. His paper is Voicing the Voiceless, 2 Approaches to Reconstructing Marginalized History.
Hi, I'm Rowan, and I'm going to be talking about ways you can revoice marginalised people in history. The ventriloquism of the speaking subaltern is the left intellectual's stock in trade. In her seminal essay, Can the Subaltern Speak?, Gayatri Spivak asked whether the voices of marginalised people can speak through time, even if they were not afforded the opportunity to speak to power in life. In her exploration of the topic, Spivak raises the danger of ventriloquism. Intellectuals may risk posing their own preconceptions as the lived experience of marginalised groups. This warning is especially relevant to historians, who often have to rely on sources which efface marginalised voices and thus allow a historian to speak in their stead. Spivak suggests this reproduces the epistemic violence of colonialism by ensuring that the lived experience of the marginalised people are never truly centred. Perhaps the simplest way to avoid speaking for marginalised people is to elevate marginalised voices, both as the subjects and the authors of history. However, those outside of the dynamic of power are often not privileged with a voice that can be retrieved by historians. Indeed, Spivak concluded originally that the subaltern cannot speak. This view has since been revised, but it is true that there are often not clear voices with which a historian can engage. It is also worth noting that writing history as a marginalised person is not sufficient to avoid ventriloquism in our works. We exist in knowledge systems that perpetuate marginalisation and must continually be aware of this. Historians may be able to represent marginalised history, but cannot represent marginalised people. I don't aim to provide an authoritative answer on how best to study marginalised history. Rather, I want to suggest 2 imaginative ways to approximate historical voices: prosopographical microhistory and academic historical fiction. Prosopography is the study of the common characteristics of a group by collective study of their lives, and applying this approach on a highly specific level can create an approximation of a historical voice. Academic fiction is that written with the knowledge and skills of a historian, and can create new ways to understand and relate to marginalised history. Neither of these approaches can recover a genuine historical voice, nor redress the violence of marginalisation, but they provide opportunity to get a fuller picture of marginalised people than exists in the archives. The skull of Allenberg is an example of how prosopography and microhistory can intersect to approximate a historical voice. The book is based around a skull given to Wagner by the owners of the Lord Clyde pub in Kent, which came in with a note in the eye socket outlining the skull's history and role in the Indian Uprising of 1857. The note said little more than Allenberg's name, his rank, regiment, execution, and the crime he was accused of, as well as the information of the man who brought his skull back to England. From this scant information, Wagner tried to recover something of the life story of Allenberg as a person involved in the Indian Uprising. Almost no information on Beg existed. He is named in no documents other than the one found inside of his own skull. Beyond knowing that Beg was in the 46th Bengal Native Infantry and was stationed at Sialkot Cantonment during the Indian Uprising, Wagner knew nothing about him, and thus turned to a collective study of sepoys and their common characteristics. In other words, a subaltern prosopography. By pairing this method with other written sources from Sialkot, most notably the letters of the victims named in the note, Wagner was able to reconstruct life in the cantonment at the time of the mutiny. The collective study of Indian soldiers allows Wagner to impart the circumstances of their lives and uncover their motivations to rebel. By simultaneously grounding this at Sialkot, the sketch of the rebels acquires substance, bringing them to life in their own context. The study brings to light the conflicting loyalties, startling violence, and surprising mercy of the Sialkot soldiers, and humanises both them and their victims. This is made especially effective by Wagner asking the reader throughout to think about Allenberg himself, speculating about his emotions and his actions at the time of the mutiny. Begg personalises the theme of the book, and in understanding them, we come much closer to understanding him. The book cannot bring back Allenberg's own voice, but it does demonstrate a compelling method of historical retrieval. From a skull and a scrap of paper, Wagner creates a very human portrait of a rebel. Historical fiction offers another way to personalise marginalised people in history and recreate an approximation of their voice. Through fiction, it is possible to imagine marginalised voices and explore the reality of their lives that may not be contained within the archive. Omaseke Tinsley has suggested that fiction can help recapture the experience of Marty in Atlantic oceanography. Marty is a term for same-gender relationships between those who survived the Middle Passage together, literally meaning shipmates. Tinsley describes this relationship as Black Atlantic same-sex eroticism, which existed as a practice of resistance, finding humanity in a dehumanising situation. Taking place in the holds of slave ships and on plantations, these relationships are outside of the historical record, but Tinsley suggests that historical fiction can allow their voices to be resurrected. This method does not offer to tell a documentable story, rather it disrupts provocatively, questioning existing narratives and bringing to light lost histories. The stipulation that historical fiction is not historical truth is important. However, this does not stop it from being an authentic representation of the past. By accurately conveying the past within a fictional narrative, historical fiction can bring to light lost historical experiences. James Ward has suggested that authenticity is possible if sufficient academic research is applied to the task, research meaning both a body of knowledge and a specialised way of thinking about the past. These works do not aspire to a status of truth in the same way as history, but they engage with dialogues closely related to the truth. They are meaningful and historical ways of engaging with the past. When confronting topics about which very little evidence survives, a problem especially true of marginalised histories of all types, historical fiction can be a highly useful method in approximating authentic voices. The two methods above are ways of approximating historical voices, but they are not the only ways. Indeed, aspects of each approach may be combined to create radically different ways of understanding the past. Raghu Karnad, in Farthest Field, undertakes forensic non-fiction by writing a fictionalised account of his own personal family's history during the Second World War, while in Wayward Lives, Saidiya Hartman crafts a history of young black women in America at the turn of the century using archival material and close narration. Both make use of fiction to elaborate on the interior lives of their subjects, but the works are very different and achieve different goals. Farthest Field is a fictionalised microhistory. It focuses on a single story of Raghu Karnad's grandparents and granduncles and their experiences as Indian soldiers in forgotten sectors of the Second World War. Hartman's approach is much more prosopographical and uses fiction and speculation to craft a counter-narrative liberated from the judgment and violence of her sources. These are things like prison records and sociological documents, which present black women in a certain way but do not speak with their own voice. Hartman's concept of critical fabulation, the use of speculation to destabilise the authorised account of events, is not only an attempt to recover the ennobled voice of the marginalised, but also to bring to light and challenge the biases of her sources themselves. Both approaches that I've suggested so far have the ability to challenge this authorised record, be it a note in a skull or prison records of black women, and this is a final and valuable benefit to attempting the impossible task of revoicing the voiceless. To conclude, I'd like to ask a question to everyone here at this conference. How would you attempt to revoice marginalised people in history? I have presented some suggestions of ways of doing so, but there are others, and I hope you will consider them in your own work going forward. As aspiring historians, we think about the past, but we should not underestimate the power of recreating marginalised voices for changing how we think about our own future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rowan. Our final speaker is Tallulah Pepperell from the University of Essex, and she's going to be speaking about feminism, pacifism and aristocracy, the politics of Irene Clyde.
Okay, I suppose this is sort of my answer to the previous presentation. This is my whistle-stop tour of the personal politics of one early 20th century transgender woman, Irene Clyde. I suppose a little introduction. Irene Clyde was the sole editor of the gender norm-breaking journal Urania, published between 1916 and 1940. She chose newspaper articles from around the world, penned her own columns, made editor's notes, and responded to letters from fans. She also repeatedly advertised her own books throughout the issues, the bravery of which I admire completely. Okay, there's a slide missing. It's fine. Irene Clyde lived publicly as lawyer Thomas Beatty. Beatty started his career by winning scholarships to Oxford and Cambridge, had doctorates in law from both universities, was admitted to the Honourable Society of the Inner Temple, whatever that is, and became the secretary of the International Law Association. Beatty was an internationally recognised legal scholar who moved to Japan to serve as the chief legal advisor to the Foreign Office, but was soon branded a traitor by the British government and stripped of citizenship after the Second World War. In public, Thomas Beatty lived as an aristocratic man whose great loves were heraldry and international law. In her writing, Irene Clyde put forward her unique political ideology: feminism, pacifism, and aristocracy. These ideals were so important to Irene Clyde that they were even mentioned in Beatty's obituary. This three-word phrase encapsulates all of Clyde's ideology, one that both advocates for the abolishment of sex, which would be gender roles in modern terms, and then at the same time advocates for the role of the aristocracy of the working class. This is, of course, a fundamentally contradictory ideology. How can one person who vehemently opposes the rule of one sex over another then support the rule of one class of person over the rest? I believe that Clyde's political beliefs stem from her intrinsic need to protect her own unique vision of beauty. The first part of this tour is to outline Clyde's most basic political tenets. There is, of course, feminism, pacifism, and aristocracy. However, to better understand these three, and the final conclusion of beauty, there are two more that need to be covered just quickly. The first is the idea that there is no male or female. This was the running ideology of Urania, an idea that the gender roles of male and female simply creates two warped and imperfect states, and that the only way to create true equality was to remove those two binary oppositions. Let women be independent and strong. Let men be sweet and gentle. Let people be people. Urania took the format of what we might call a modern zine. The main bulk of the content was taken from newspaper articles from around the world. Other content included poetry, adverts for schools, letters, and articles written by Clyde. The content covered issues such as reports of spontaneous or chosen sex changes, wrongly ascribed sexual identity, women defying gender stereotypes by committing acts of bravery or criminality, many cases of cross-dressing, and even articles on religion, education, biology, and equality. Every article was chosen to prove that ideas of binary sex roles were false. The next tenet that is crucial to understanding Clyde's politics is her theories on the act of sex. To quote the great Inigo Montoya, "Let me explain. No, there is too much. Let me sum up." Sex is unacceptable because it inherently subjugates women. Sex between a man and a woman only reinforces the sex roles of female submission and male domination. Heterosexual sex is not solely a physical act. It is a statement of political inequality between men and women, and any woman who willingly submits to sex is accepting her own inferiority and is therefore contributing to a world of sexual inequality. There's no mention of any other sexual pairings. Clyde's ideas on nudity, masturbation, and flagellation are far more complex than I've laid out on the slides, so I will only cover them briefly. For Clyde, the human body is a site of disgust, masturbation's a healthy practice, and flagellation is an abomination of dominance and sexual humiliation, especially when used as corporal punishment for children and prisoners. With those details in hand, I will now introduce her three main tenets. Feminism is not what we would expect in the modern day. One would be forgiven if they thought that Clyde's push for the removal of male and female meant that she was simply for sex equality. She is also of the opinion that there is a better way to be, and it's to be more feminine. In both Eve's Sour Apples and Urania, she constantly espouses the virtues of women, feminine men, and femininity in every form. In the final chapter of Eve's Sour Apples, she calls femininity the root of that considerate temper which flowers and fruits in courtesy, tenderness, peace, kindness to animals, charm, refinement. If we suppress the cultivated feminine ideal, we destroy the life of the world. In the end, she holds up femininity as the ideal form which all should aspire to, and also as the direct contrast to masculinity. Masculinity which breeds only negativity. For Irene, the worst aspect of masculinity is the violence inherent in it. To quote an article in Urania, where she puts forward her unique opinion on war, war is not the fault of the old men. It is the fault of the young who still agree to fight. The true root of war is simply masculine ferocity. War is a male thing, and as long as boys are taught to fight and to domineer, it is impossible to hope that war can ever be eliminated. It is important to note that she is not suggesting that these traits are inherent in all men from birth, simply that boys and girls are taught to act in certain ways from childhood. Women are taught to be submissive, men to be dominant. Because men are taught to be dominators, both sexually and non-sexually, this need for dominance will eventually develop into violence. And then this violence from millions of young men across the world will inevitably develop into war. So, femininity is to be idealised, masculinity is to be avoided in order to create peace. Aristocracy is a seemingly confusing outlier in such radical politics, but to Irene it made perfect sense. To her, the aristocracy embodies delicacy and consideration, careful living and civilization. In order to create a world of peace and femininity, the aristocracy must rule. Is this classist? Absolutely. In earlier works, Clyde argued for co-education of the sexes. In later works, she sets down that co-education of the classes would be destruction of beauty. She argues that co-education of the aristocracy and lower classes would be the equivalent of elixir vitae spilled into a bucket of cold water, and would extinguish the spark of loveliness inherent in the aristocracy. To enable peace in our world, the aristocracy, with their feminine delicacy and class, must rule over all others. To Irene Clyde, the most important thing in the world was protecting beauty. The beauty in sweetness, the beauty of peace, the beauty of animals, the beauty of the feminine, and of the aristocratic nature. To advocate the rule of the lower classes was to advocate the destruction of beauty. Only the aristocratic, cultured classes held true beauty in them, and that was why they should rule. Irene Clyde was a unique figure with unique political views. Her views were shaped by her understanding of gender inequality in her world, her personal experiences of gendered spaces and expectations, her privileged life as a member of the Edwardian upper class, and her life as a privileged foreigner in Japan. From these experiences developed a progressive view of gender and sexual equality, but one that took form with a privileged aristocratic aspect. To most decently sum up her political opinions, Clyde lamented that universal suffrage had deprived the vote of all meaning. Not because women achieved the vote, but because the lower classes had achieved it as well. So there you have it, a very brief tour of Irene Clyde's personal politics, her beliefs on gender, sex, femininity, pacifism, and the rule of aristocracy. A brief exploration of how radical ideologies intersect through many ideas of minority and privilege. A brief introduction to one very interesting woman. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for those wonderful papers. Again, a really broad range. And so it's left to me to try and tie it together in some way that doesn't do any injustice or violence to the specificities of the papers which have been delivered. The theme of the panel was resistance, and I think if we expand the idea of resistance to thinking about any type of activity that is running against the grain of the societal norms or of dominant power structures, then we can see that in the papers we've seen there. But I wanted to draw out what might be slightly different emphasis, even though they are overlapping in the type of resistance we're talking about here. There is the history of resistance, and then there's history as itself a form of resistance. So I think some of the histories of resistance we saw here were not so much resistance in a violent, aggressive standoff against the state necessarily, but resistance in the form of surviving, preserving, persisting in the face of adversity, whether that was maintaining the health of communities, whether that was trying to find these happy spaces in which women were able to interact free, or relatively free of that interference, or a resistance that was preserving the finer things. It might be how Irene would put it. We see that recovering of that history of those forms of resistance which is there. And then I think what Rowan's paper does is to get us to think about history as itself a form of resistance. What types of histories do we recover, and what work does that do in the present? And the other papers do also touch on those, often in the conclusions. What I want to push us on a little bit is how do we think through that relationship, the history of resistance itself, and then the resistance work that history does when we recover it. And slightly nervous about treading on the toes of the next panel, which is about identity. I wonder whether we might think of it slightly through identification in different ways. So Sanmitra and Tallulah papers really get into the identification of the subjects themselves. So how the Black Panthers identified with their communities, discovered what their needs were and tried to rectify those. Or how Irene identified with gender norms at the time and orientated herself within that. But we also might think of identification in terms of the relationship between the historian and their subjects. And Laura, I felt that there was, in your paper, an identification both with a place, but also with the women of that place that inspired part of the history that you were doing. There was a connection there. But then there's also another layer of identification that I think is there in Rowan's point, that is about the identification that the imagined audience for history might have with the subject that the historian is writing about, and crafting history in such a way as that those readers can identify with subjects who may be far removed from their own world experiences. So I guess what that might push me to think about is Sumitra to think about how she identifies with the Black Panthers, or would like other people to identify with the Black Panthers. Similarly to Lula, to think about how you identify with Irene or don't. Laura, to think about how you might like this history to be linked to a particular audience, or to bring people to identify with a place in a different way. And Rowan to think about perhaps what types of historical subjects you identify with and might want to recover as histories. So I don't know who wants to go first. I'm not going to push that on anyone. Or you could just ruminate in silence on my overly complicated question.
So I think the question about who you identify with as an audience is really important, because I think that so often when you look at the way that history's been written before and who has written history before, the subject is sort of assumed to be, especially European, especially male, especially cis and stuff like that. And so I think that by writing different histories and by writing histories of different people, you create ways for people who are currently outside of the sort of like academic world to relate to history and become interested in it. And I think this is something that sort of comes up in the RHS report, which is that like there aren't that many people studying history from BME backgrounds, and there aren't that many people teaching it. And I sort of think that through things like fiction or through microhistory, which are very accessible often, it's possible for people to see themselves in the history that's being written and thus want to write it themselves or want their kids to write it themselves.
Okay, I'd like to preface this by saying that I do not identify with Irene Clyde at all. I spent most of my time researching her, texting my friend, just going, what is she saying? What is this? She just said that universal suffrage is a step back. Like, what's going on? But I think that's so important to, like, to identify with a person so you understand that they're human. Like, people aren't fictional. There aren't the heroes and there aren't the villains in our past. Irene Clyde wrote some amazing things about war and about peace, and she wrote, she archived these great journals which sort of celebrates destroying gender roles and sex changes and has very sort of liberal, like, progressive views. And then she was also really classist and really awful about lower class people and believed that they should all be controlled by the aristocracy because of some virtue of actions. And I think that's important for us to remember, because we can sometimes hold people from the past up and say they are a perfect shining light of what we need to do right or what we need to do wrong. And if I said that about Irene, no, definitely not. And I think it's something that can be lost in history, is we idealise historical figures. We make them something, we make them either a shining, glorious person or this hideous villain. And the fact is, they are people like us and like we've always been, and we need to remember them as such so we don't repeat their mistakes. Yeah.
I think also the issue about making them more human or more relatable also helps with the idea of an audience, because I learned that during my research. If I just started talking about this Peruvian convent, most of my friends would lose interest after 5 minutes. But if I start talking about this woman who would pretend to go on a religious retreat to actually meet with the lovers every evening, that becomes interesting. That becomes almost gossip. And that led the conversation into something else. And they're like, oh, actually, maybe 17th or 18th century history is not that boring. It can be, because obviously if you're not doing history as a major, for my friends who are doing computer science, it's a bit difficult to explain why I'm doing the topic. And I think it can be also just as a way, as you were saying, of history as resistance. Because if you want to create the audience, there's interests in it. And if there's interests, it's not just going to be forgotten. There's going to be people asking you, but what happened to them? Where did they go? Or where can I find more information about it? And once you have just the public's attention, that's where it all starts, I think.
When I first had when I had taken the USA module in the University of Warwick, I was amazed to know that we would be taught indigenous histories. I never could imagine that we would be taught indigenous history of USA before the European colonialists settled down. So that was the first step towards me moving to researching the Black Panther Party. About resistance, I think I personally am resisting to a particular group of people who believe that history is written down by the victors and not the victims. So I'm talking about people who were victims in some ways when they were shown in a bad light. Their achievements were hid from the world. I am resisting to the fact that they were bad people. They were people who were violent. I am with my arguments. I am not moving around with a gun or a barrel. I am resisting with my arguments, with my research, and we all are. All of us in this panel are resisting with our knowledge. And as Martin Luther King Jr. said, that of all injustices, the injustice to healthcare is the most inhumane. I didn't quote him, but he said something similar to this. So healthcare is a basic necessity of life. And if someone, the FBI or the state, is resisting to people who provide free healthcare to other people in their community, I, as a historian, and we as students of history, would resist to the idea of that. Thank you.
Okay, I think we're going to open it up for questions now. We're going to fold it into the question. We're going to invite Catherine down as well for this. Do you want to do that? Do you want to come down, Catherine?
People have things they want to ask. Or comment.
Okay, is there any questions?
Thank you. I thought that was a very interesting range of talks, but I have a question for Rowan, though technically I'm answering your question first and then asking you what I think, because I, as part of my dissertation, I'm looking at methodologies of history and using new methodologies of history to study marginalized histories, so that was perfectly interesting to me. So I'm looking at specifically using reenactment and experimentation to fill in the gaps in marginalised histories where there's not the same wealth of primary sources you might get in other places. And I wonder what you thought about that, basically.
I think the ideas of things like reenactment and especially experimentation and experimental archaeology are really cool and really interesting ways of engaging with the past. And also I think they really bring them to life in a way that is, again, really accessible to people. And just cool. It's cool to see, and I really enjoy that. I think it's not something that I thought about when writing my paper, but I do think it does have a sort of similar ability that by reenacting things from the past that might be being forgotten, we can bring them to life again and people can see and experience them rather than just see and relate to them. So I think that's really cool. Thanks.
I'm sure the organisers would both appreciate it if you could just cluster your questions in some parts of the room.
Hi, thank you to all of you for amazing and interesting talks. I have a question for Talila. I thought your talk was amazing, really interesting. As somebody who does study queer history and marginalised histories from that perspective, I thought it was interesting what you said about the sort of presenting the humanity of individuals, and I was wondering what you thought about often this idea, particularly within queer history and women's history, of presenting resistance figures as kind of heroes, and how we can balance that and sort of in promoting sort of the virtue and the benefits of things with obviously the human nature of them, and how you balance that.
That's a really good one. I'm not entirely certain. I don't think I can give you an exact answer. I think for me, and this is a little bit it's a bit personal, I'm gay, and when I was younger I didn't really hear about any gay people at all, rarely. And I remember reading about two sort of, I believe they were Tutankhamun's hairdressers, and they were a gay couple, and it sort of opened my eyes because, oh my goodness, they're people, and they also like people of the sex? What's happening here? And I think for a very long time the LGBTQ plus community has been presented as villains, and therefore it's really important to present, an antithesis to that, to present heroes. But then I think you also risk losing people. If you'd shown little me someone who was perfect and had done all these amazing things and was like an icon of LGBT history, I wouldn't have been able to resonate. I was a little shit. I was 13. I was angry with the world. I think seeing people as people helps you resonate with that, and you understand that, and then you understand, oh, they're human, and then maybe you think, oh, I'm human, and then, oh, these other people are human, and I think it creates a more long-lasting impression of a very old community rather than just holding up a few icons and especially if you put people up on pedestals, eventually they're going to fall. Somebody's going to throw something, they're going to come crashing down, and then suddenly we can never talk about that person ever again because they did a bad thing once. I think it's important to say, here's this person, they did some amazing things. They also did some awful things, or they maybe didn't have the best political views because of the time period. And that way you can see them as sort of good all round, not idols, just examples. Yeah, I think that's...
Hi, sorry, my question kind of follows on quite nicely from what you talked about before. But I'm kind of doing a similar kind of period looking at 19th and 20th century queer women. And I think it was really interesting what you were saying about the aristocracy, because a lot of the people I'm looking at, I'm studying the painter Romain Brooks, who was supportive of Mussolini's fascism. And if we look at kind of Anne Lister and her kind of conservative views towards the working class, I was just wondering, you kind of answered it in a way, but how you think we should navigate this and why you think this might be that these elite women have got these kind of extreme views, if this is important in looking at these women who are both like central and marginal in their own ways.
I think it's really important to sort of remember that they're multifaceted. I joked to one of my friends, I was like, Irene Clyde would be a swerf. She'd definitely be a sex worker exclusionary radical feminist nowadays. She would hate that. And I just think it's important to remember the time period in which these people lived, and again, sort of, I believe the word's historicity, can't remember that, is where you put your modern day viewpoints onto people in the past. And I think if we do that, we lose what made them so remarkable. Because I think probably a lot of the aristocracy in Irene Clyde's time thought that they should rule. Yeah, they probably thought exactly the same thing as her. They probably thought, the working class are all violent and should not have the vote. And I think maybe we should take that into account rather than discounting it, because then if you look at her by saying, well, she is a very aristocratic Edwardian woman, but she had these very radical views, rather than saying she had these very radical views, but she was more aristocratic. So it's sort of comparing, contrasting, and what makes her unique. Sorry if that was very rambly. Just sort of picking it out instead of pushing it to the side. Yeah.
Am I allowed to ask another question? I was going to ask Tolu a question too, but I feel that you might need a break. But I did have a question for Laura, if you don't mind. You talked so passionately about a country that obviously is very, very important to you. when we look at the way in which we study these marginalised groups within the university environment, and maybe we could kind of talk on this a little bit, did you find that, I mean, your access to sources, it could be a question that goes to anybody on the panel, but have you ever found that you've had limitations within your own academia, within your own school or faculty, with getting access to sources and getting access to archives and stuff? Because it's something that I think that we've maybe all in our work potentially had issues with. And do you think that there's something that we should be doing as historians? Should we, as Catherine said, be making more anger? Should we be voicing our anger more about the fact that we are struggling to access like marginalised histories that we really want to look at? And I wondered what your experience was like, obviously studying in Scotland and looking at something in Peru.
Yeah, I think most of us had this issue simply because we're all doing very niche topics. So the fact that I was studying in Scotland something that happened in Peru in the 18th century was even worse, let's say. And even just on my topic, the archives were impossible to access just because they moved so many times that one place would have archives of them for 50 years and then another place would have archives for 10 years or something like that. And I still haven't found where the last 50 years of their existence have ended up. I just don't know where they are. But in terms of what we can do about it, I think what I did a lot during my research was just talking about it with my supervisor or even just the library, being like, hi, I keep having to ask for books from the British Library, or some of my books are not even in the country, they're in the US or in Europe or in Peru. So I had the opportunity to travel, which was great, but I know that most people did not, like I had a travel fund to do that thanks to my research, but I was very lucky to do so. And I think in terms of what we can do is just really ask for it, because most universities, they have some funds and they have funds, and sometimes they're just not using them because students, instead of asking for it, they're like, oh, the book is not there, that's fine, I'll just look for another one, or I'll change the topic, or maybe there's not enough literature. And there is a lot of literature about a lot of topics, it's just having to find it and being able to just compile it or having access to it. So I used the interlibrary loans a lot during that time. And yeah, kind of annoyed the librarians a lot about, can I buy this book, please?
I have a question about the Black Panthers, actually. I thought it was really interesting what you were saying, and I was wondering, kind of, especially now, like, not necessarily how it'd be possible to replicate it, but what do you think we can take from that to kind of build something kind of new and to kind of recreate some of the opportunities they were putting forward in funding?
I think Alondra Nelson, she is an African-American activist, and she's also a writer, author, actually. She mentions in her book about what we can do today as under hashtag Black Lives Matter. So I think about your question, about what we can do really now is racism continues, and we need more activism of that sort in order to solve our problem right now. Because I think I didn't personally have many books or resource pieces when I was researching Black Panther Party and when I wanted to do something on it. And when I went through whatever I had, and I went through the newspapers and whatever they had published, I found that a lot of work is still to be done. A lot of activism is left to be done to improve the conditions of these communities, the African American and the oppressed people. So I think we should do. Does that answer your question? I'm really confused. Thank you.
My question is also for Sinmitra. I was curious if you had looked into the intersections that this kind of outgrowth of the Black Panther Party may have had in response to the Tuskegee medical experiments, if you're familiar with those.
Pardon me?
So, the Tuskegee medical experiments.
Yeah.
Yeah, so do you think that maybe this kind of community developed, I guess, medical response to the needs of the African American community? Do you think in any way that may have been a response to the kind of unethical treatment that they had been facing at the hands of the kind of the CDC and the American government at large?
Yes, I think I have mentioned in my research paper that they were used. They were being used in research, in experiments. So I think that's what you're talking about. So they were used in research, and that was very unethical and very undermining their identities, using them for experiment in laboratories. I think it did lead to Black Panther Party, the formation, and it's taking up healthcare initiatives. But I think there are a whole lot of factors. Even feminism is a factor, because many of the Black Panther Party members were females. And when the government said that, it's a African American supremacist group, it is undermining that it played other roles. So about your question, I think that yes, it definitely had an effect, and there are a whole lot of other unfair treatments that the African Americans were subject to, which compelled, sort of, if I may use the word, the Black Panther Party and other groups, like counterculture groups like the New Left, and it has been for years. The Negro medical renaissance has begun since slavery, and it is not very, it's not very time bound that this period was the specific period. Yes, so I don't know, but yes, it did, and other factors also contribute. So did I answer your question in any way?
Yeah, I think so. Thank you.
Thank you.
Of course.
So I know you've had a little bit of a discussion about viewing historical actors as whole people rather than as heroes or as villains. But you also mentioned sort of historicity and viewing people as a product of their time. And I wondered what any of you, not just Tallulah, would say in response to the argument that, for example, when we look at figures who lived in a racist time and were great on some things but were racist, and when we accept that, we erase the struggles and the sort of experiences and the fight that was going on that other people were doing. So the other people within that time that was racist were not racist and were doing amazing anti-racist projects. So I wondered what you thought to that argument.
I think that's a really important point, because I think that obviously people are a product of their time, but we often, it's often used, especially by people defending figures, to defend a whole litany of errors which actually were being criticised in their time. I haven't finished the book myself, but I know that Priya Gopal has written a really good book, Insurgent Empire, which is talking about anti-racism in the 18th, 19th century, in India, in the colonies, and in Europe and in England. And it's about challenging the narrative that people of their time were always racist. And I think that, obviously, you shouldn't write off people in history because they had views that we would now view as unacceptable. But I think that it is important to also say that actually it was viewed as unacceptable at the time, and that shouldn't sanitize them and the way that we understand them now.
No, it's definitely, yeah, that's, so in my research, part of one of Irene's sort of where she talks about it in the fun chapter for the book, Sarah Apples, she talks about that specifically, and then she states specifically that she noticed that her views on the aristocracy set her apart from a lot of her contemporaries at Urania, that a lot of the people she was friends with and sort of discussed gender equality with, they were like, yes, and then the working class should take power. And she was like, no, I don't agree with that. And so I think, yeah, it's definitely important to remember that it's definitely important we can't... Sorry, wording. Yeah, I definitely do believe that saying, oh, everyone was racist back then, it does erase the effort, the work of those who weren't. And yes, I'd say that me saying that that a lot of the aristocracy were against the working class does erase those who weren't. I think specifically for Irene Clyde, because it's such an important part of her political philosophy, that it has to be taken into account, because it's not just a side thing, it's an actual statement of her entire political belief. But I do think it's very important to remember that she was an outlier in those around her, but then that's also a reminder that history has so many facets of sort of interlocking ideas of like prejudice and marginalisation, that there's not always one clear thread to pull out. And we just need to keep looking for the other threads to pull out. That makes sense.
Can I say something?
Yes?
Well, I just want to say that I think it's also terribly important to try and understand why people are racist, and that we don't only need to understand who the anti-racists are, we need to understand what the structures are and what the kinds of beliefs are that make people racists. And that, actually, in so many periods, if we're to understand fascism, or if we're to understand racism, we have to try and occupy the minds of people who were and are fascists and were and are racists. So although I'm very, very sympathetic to all of you doing marginal histories, actually what I'm most preoccupied with is understanding the centre, not the margins, because without understanding the centre, how do we undo it? How do we unpick it? How do we change it? And actually, it's very, very interesting that so many different things have been said, but I think that question of that we've been circling around identification and how is it? We don't just want, at least I don't just want to understand people like me. I want to understand people who are different from me. Because if we're going to live in this society in the future, you could say the great problem of the 21st century, the problem of the 20th century was the problem of colour, as Du Bois said. The problem of the 21st century is how to live with difference. If we cannot live with others, if we can't live with the people we other, never mind those who other us, what kind of world are we going to be able to make? So, identifying, trying to understand people whose... it's very, very interesting listening to you, Tallulah, because trying to understand people who are both so different from us, and yet, you know there's something there to understand. You know there's something worthwhile about thinking about what makes this woman have this peculiar combination of ideas. And if you can somehow get a hold on her, you might understand how her psyche works, and why she's got some power, as well as, also being in some ways quite repellent. So anyway, I'm making a claim for understanding the centre as well as the margins.
On that note, does anyone have any questions for Catherine, either about her work or specifically the keynote lecture she gave? Or we can return to the other panellists.
You all want to do the margins.
Yeah.
Actually, this isn't a question specifically for you, but it's a question I would pose to you that is it really useful to draw a distinction between the centre and the margin? Because I think they're fluid and that context is fluid. And I think in terms of what you were talking about, it's about understanding interaction within certain contexts. So I think it's, again, categorizing to talk about centers and margins, but more about, I'm a psychologist, so I really resonate with this, but it's more about understanding people in their context. So, you know, if I'm a racist, it's political and structural things around me that have bred those views. And it's really important to understand them. But at the same time, it's really important to understand the people who, because they don't have the power, are having certain behaviors done to them or being made to feel wrong. So it's something more about interconnectionality than about centres and margins. And I wonder what you think about that.
Well, what I think about that is there's the question of power.
Yeah.
That's what's, you know, I mean, when I spoke, I was trying to raise that question of, well, who's the centre? Who do you think the centre is? What's the centre? You know, who has the power? Well, I work on Jamaica in the 18th century. I know who had the power. And I know how difficult resistance was, of any of the kinds of resistance you're describing. I know that people, black people, struggled to survive and to have some kind of life in the most difficult and harsh and cruel circumstances. And some of them didn't make it. Lots of them didn't make it. Some of them survived, etc. But there were power relations in that society. So it's not just about interconnection as if we're all equal. We're not all equal. There's deep inequalities. So, you know, if you look at a society like a colonial society, a slave society, then you know it's so obvious that how power operates. If you look at our society now, it's obviously much more complex to try and understand where power lies. You know, does it lie with Rupert Murdoch, or does it lie with the government, or does it lie with multinationals, or, you know, and what are the alliances around those, or is it really all to do with Facebook, or, you know, and so we can go on. There are so many different kinds of power, but there's still power, and that's what creates inequality. So it may not be a centre and loads of margins. There may be a lot of centres and a lot of margins, but still we come back to questions of power, I would argue.
Thank you. On that note, we're going to close this panel discussion.